right, continuing on there. Thank you for so many that have stuck around. And continuing through this study of the church history, we're going to be moving kind of a little faster pace. We've built up quite a bit of our lessons about this medieval Roman Catholic Church, or the Holy Roman Church, however you want to describe this entity. But this church is building up, and now all of a sudden we looked last week at the Muslim influence of these individuals that were going to be coming in and attacking the border there on the east. And what we're going to be looking at today is how the Pope is going to send out individuals for these crusades in order to get back the Holy Land. So many have probably heard of the Crusades. I know there's often different things depicted about it, some good, some bad, but the idea of what's happening, because these were Christians, allegedly, that were going down and doing these things. So sometimes it seems like it was not good for the events that were happening. So what we're going to be looking at is in the 12th and 13th centuries, they saw a migration of people from Western Europe to the east to recover the Holy Lands from the Turks. And we're going to get into some slides here in just a minute, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, this land coming in. But these crusades would last from the year 1095 to 1272. So almost 200 years of this, the beginning there in around 1000 AD, that are going to be taking place, that they're going to continue to go down, just kind of, I think they'll have about 5 different crusades that will be happening. I guess if you, the official maybe crusades going down in order to receive this land back. Now, Helena, those have been following from the beginning of this. Remember Constantine, remember his mother Helena, and how she was wanting to kind of have these symbols of the Christian place where Jesus was at in Palestine, that she was trying to depict certain places like the Golgotha and the tomb of Christ, and she was like the house of Mary and things like that. So she was trying to, going from tradition, we don't have any of that recorded for us in the Bible. We're not finding any of that, but through tradition, they were saying, well, yes, this is the house that Peter stayed in and things like that. So what she was doing was kind of idolizing these places, saying, well, yes, if you're a real devout Christian, you would go to the hill of Golgotha where Christ was even crucified. And if you remember some of that, that she allegedly found the cross that Christ was nailed to, found the nails that were used and all those things. But anyway, people get wound up about that, and they still do today, with the idea of it'll be more religious, right? It'll be more emotional if I can go to the actual place. Now, there's nothing wrong with visiting the Middle East, going over there and looking at the Holy Land and seeing these things. I think it helps us depict certain things. I know Mr. Harold and I were talking the other day. When the Bible says the wilderness, a lot of times I think of like Alaska or Canada as wilderness, but for Palestine in that area, wilderness was more desert than it was trees. So it does help you kind of get an idea of the events that were going on and the depiction of everything. But nonetheless, it doesn't make me even more of a Christian or less of a Christian if I don't visit these places. If you recall, last week when we spoke about Muhammad, he said you need to make a trek to Mecca, right? That gathering place for the Muslims at least once in your life. Well, we're not commanded to do any of those things. So, devout Christians desire to revisit the land where Jesus spent his earthly existence. Again, kind of a more spiritual type atmosphere for them. And after the development of the sacrament of penance, pilgrimages were looked upon as a particular means of acquiring merit in heaven. So we have the bishops and the popes beginning now to say, well, if you do these things, right, you can earn your way into heaven. That's what the sacrament of penance was, is that if you're doing these good deeds, I think Mr. Dave and I were talking about this morning, it's like a balancing scale, right? You say, well, I'm not really living my life like I need to be, but doing all these good things. And the Catholic Church, or the Holy Roman Catholic Church, would say, well, that's evening everything out in that way. Well, again, nowhere in Scripture do we find this, but it was appealing to people nonetheless. Now, as we continue on, the Mohammedan Arabs would take over the Palestine in the 7th century. So if I'm going to be a devout Christian, I've got to go down into Palestine to visit these places, visit Jerusalem. But again, the Arabs were moving up, and the influence of Muhammad and the Muslims were rising up, and they began to take over Jerusalem. Right today, if you go, you can't go to the temple. It was destroyed in AD 70 by Titus. Ultimately, Titus. Vespasian would begin that siege. Titus would finish it, and he deported all the Jews, or he killed all the Jews that were left in Jerusalem. And we find that in the depiction of Matthew chapter 24. When you read that chapter, that's what Jesus is saying. When you see these things come about, get out. It has nothing to do with today. It's that Titus was going to come in, the Roman army would come in and destroy that city, and he did. They said, Jesus said that no stone will be left upon another, and that's the case. The gold that was in the temple, those that have been following along in Exodus class and now into Numbers, remember all the gold and the vessels that were in the temple and the treasury that was in the temple, and when they burned the temple, the gold melted within the cracks of the rocks, and the Roman soldiers found out, and they tore every stone apart to get to the gold that had leaked down between that. So from that, Jesus' prophecy of no stone being left upon another was absolutely true. You can go over there today, you can see pictures, I think you can search the web and find it, that the rocks look like they're just thrown off down in those valleys, and that's exactly what happened. Now, the temple's destroyed, but today, if you look at Jerusalem, what is sitting on the old temple mound today? Does anybody know? The Dome of the Rock, the Muslim temple, right? It's a mosque. It's a mosque that sits right actually on top of where the temple lay. I should have got a slide of that to put up there. But the Dome of the Rock sits there, so it's Muslim occupied now. So many people, as we begin to look through Revelation and further, they will begin to look at that and say, well, the temple has to be rebuilt. Well, Jesus can't come back until the temple's rebuilt. Well, friends, the Jews aren't going to rebuild the temple anytime soon. One, they don't have to, because we don't have to have the high priest in the temple anymore. But because the Muslims have a mosque over it, and you could imagine the war that would erupt if somebody tried to go in there to destroy that mosque over the top of the temple. If you happen to go over there, or if you read any of that, they have the weeping, wailing wall there in Jerusalem, where the Jews, it's one of the outer walls of that courtyard, and that's the only remaining, and you can see they actually stick prayers in those cracks, talking about God, wanting God to bring the Messiah, right? Because the Jews don't believe in Jesus. They're still looking for that Messiah to come and give the Jews back their national power. So from that, when you look over at those things, that's the events that are happening. It's really interesting when we see that. But Palestine now being controlled by the Muslim people. That happened even in the 7th century. So we're going to proceed from that. The Seljuk Turks captured the Holy Land in 1073, and it made it difficult to visit these sacred places. So again, Constantine, Christianity is legal. You can go to these places to be more religious, but now I can't because the Muslims that are there. So Emperor Alexius was disturbed at the power that the Turks were gaining at the emperor's borders. Now here's a slide, and what we'll look at is the idea of this invasion that's coming in for the Turks and what they were worried about. Now, those that have been following along, we have Constantinople right there. So that being in the Byzantine Empire. So this is the eastern fringe of the Roman Empire. You had the west with Rome, and then you had the east with Byzantine and Constantinople. But you can see that these individuals are coming down, and they're dropping down from Damascus. You can kind of see that yellow. So right there would be Jerusalem coming up like that. So these people are pressing, and they're pressing on into Constantinople, and they're pressing into the area, the territory, if you will, of the Roman church or the Roman Empire, pressing in there. So he's not really liking this. They're gaining more popularity, and we find there again, there's Mecca right down there, Medina, where we talked about last week with Muhammad, and then those individuals coming out. So it's not really them; it's more of the Turks coming out of this area, sweeping down and bringing about all of this. So they said, well, we can't get to Jerusalem. We can't see where Christ was crucified, and that's important to them. Now, in 1092, at the death of Malak Shah, the Turkish empire was thrown into a civil war. So all of this nation that we have depicted here, with the ruler gone, they don't know what's going on. So here's our chance. So what they say now, Alexis, who was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, so the gentleman that's going to be headquartered right there, the empire is thrown about in chaos, and he says, now we can have the opportunity to gain all of our land back from these Turks. So he called on the Pope of Rome, Urban II, to assist him in doing this. So again, the church in Constantinople and the church at Rome didn't really, as we would say, jihad together. They didn't really get together really good. So he uses this as an opportunity to kind of mend that relationship. So Urban II conveyed a synod in Clermont, France, urging the people of France and those of Western Europe to drive the Turks from Palestine. So going back to our map, you have this area over here occupied, and they said, all right, there's Europe. We're going to go down, and we're going to have these crusades. We're going to get the land back. Now, look at the reasons for this. Again, this is happening here around 1000 AD or a little after that. And the events that were happening in Europe, there was a great famine in the land. And if you think about that idea of, well, I don't have very many prospects here at home, but there's fame and glory that are going to be going about in this new area that I can go to. So they think they can get some financial gain from this. Those history nerds would understand or remember Horace Greeley's "Go West, young man," right? What was that? I'm over here. I'm on a farm. I'm having to work, and I don't like that. I hear tales of people out west. They're getting rich off of gold. They're having all these adventures. I'm going to do that. Many a young man went out for that, and many a young man went on these crusades. Now, the Normans, or these individuals up in Europe, were interested in the plundering and taking territories that belonged to the Turks. So that wasn't that long ago that that's how you did things, right? That was if I needed territory, I invaded. That was at a time before we have the civil idea of our governing systems today, that we don't just go invade people, the last being that of Japan and Germany. You just can't come in and invade. But again, we find that with with Russia and Ukraine. Again, even today, you just can't go in and take somebody's country over. That's frowned upon, but this was a very common occurrence. So they like that idea. I don't have any money. I can go and plunder these riches. I can have that. Now, again, as we talked about, the love of military adventure. Also, we have that they were trying to escape punishment. We find that even with the call to go out west, individuals would get themselves in a bit of a jam over here, and they would sign up, get into the military, or get out and get with individuals, and they would escape the punishment that was going to be here and go out. And we find that very same thing happening during the Crusades. So the direct cause can be traced to the Pope trying to take land back from the Turks. And ultimately, that's what it is, right? It's an appeal to many people in different ways, but ultimately, the emperor in Constantinople says, we got to get this land back. And the Pope says, hey, we really need to get a lot more of this land back for the church and for our empire, right? For our land. So we're going to get it all back, and we're going to do it by the Crusades. So Urban II would set forth the Crusades as a holy war, making his objective to liberate the Holy Land. So again, the appeal. We've got to go back and get Jerusalem, because that's where Jesus was crucified, so that's important. It is, but not to us like that today, right? So we don't look at any of those things as symbolic. It doesn't mean really anything. I say it doesn't mean anything. Obviously, it's important that we realize that Christ did die, and he did live, and he was an actual man that was here, and the events and the history all confirm all that. But as far as saying I need to make sure I can get to the temple is not a thing that we need to be worried about. So we look past that, but he sets this out as that. So during the first Crusades, the Pope made it clear that those who lost their lives while participating would be absolved of their sins. If you read anything or look anything about the Crusades, that was a very big push, is that I'm trying to be holy. And again, you have to understand the mindset of these individuals. If you didn't have the Bible per se so much like we do now, they had some of the writings and some of the letters, again, because we understand the true church that was established in Acts 2 never went away. We have those, but we have these apostate churches acting in this way and saying, well, I've got to get forgiveness of my sin. I'm going to go fight in a holy war, as we talked about earlier, this balancing system that if I die trying to fight for Christ, I'm going to gain a victory, but the Bible doesn't teach us that. But many people were led away to believe this. So his desire to make the journey safe to Jerusalem was the direct reason for the war. So he said, we got to be able to get down to Jerusalem. Ultimately, he said, I got to get all this land back, and we can't have these Turks coming up, the Muslims coming up to take our territory. Now, it seems that he was trying to increase the power and prestige, again, of the papacy. So he's looking at that, and that's what we're going to gain from this when we finally finish this lesson, is that it's looked upon in the way the Pope and the papacy, or this whole idea of the Holy Roman Church, is brought out. No. So from that. So another reason might be that he looked at to do this. Another reason was that he was trying to rebuild the relationships with the Byzantine Empire. So we talked about that before. The Pope in Rome, and then there's a Pope over in Constantinople. So he's trying to kind of mend that fence back together with him. He wanted to end this because he was only able to control Rome. He wanted to control all of the Roman Empire as well, because as those have been sticking along with us, the Pope is gaining more and more control even of that of the Emperor. So he, or the Pope, took one action to remove the excommunication imposed on the Byzantine Emperor by Gregory VII. So he said, all right, we're going to be able to communicate now with you again. And he hoped he would gain control over the Greek Church and help the Roman Empire. So those that have been from the beginning, the Constantinople, that soon became the Greek Orthodox Church that we hear about today. And then you have the Roman Catholic Church there in the West. Now, finally, in 1229, during the Fifth Crusade, under the leadership of Frederick II, a treaty was reached that granted land to the Christians. So through all this, they were able to get, jump right out of my hand. Through this, they were able to get this land back, and they were able to grant this, and they were beginning to achieve what they were trying to get at. So there would be several more attempts for Christians to control all of the Holy Land, but they would not be successful. So even though many of these efforts, through these efforts, they failed to make Jerusalem available for the pilgrimages from the Western Empire. So even through all this, they were able to gain some land back, but they never were able to take back control of Jerusalem. And again, that really essentially was supposed to be the whole reason for the Crusades, is we have to go back to Jerusalem. We have to go back to see all these sites of the events that were happening in Christ's life, but they failed to do so. And as we may note, that they still don't have control of. We don't have control. The Muslims have control of it today. So the original plan of the Crusades was to support Christianity against the infidel, or the non-believer, the non-Christians. However, what happened was that many, being associate with the papacy, is all things about Christianity. So what happens now is the Pope, he's had this great idea that we need to go back to where we can go to the Palestine and to the Middle East to see where Christ was, and this is important. And he began to be seen as someone that's going to fight for the rights of the Christian. Now, notice that next point. In the years that followed, it became more than fighting against infidels, but against any that arose to question the papal authority. So what happens is now essentially the Pope has an army. I've got individuals that I can say that if this is for reasons of holy orders, right? If I'm doing this and I'm saying, oh, this is for God, that I'm God incarnated, that I have now an army. And that's what we are going to find that's going to take place. So the interest of Christianity came to be looked upon simultaneously with the interest of the Pope. So he began to say, all right, well, if the Pope says we need to do this, then we need to follow it. Because he was getting together all of this, organizing all of these events during the Crusades. So as long as there were followers who were eager to receive absolutions, or to have their sins absolved from the Pope, it was not difficult for him to use such persons for the accomplishments of his purposes. Now, we're going to see more of this as we get into the opposition against the Holy Roman Church, that they're going to have such might and such power, ultimately even having what we might call mercenaries. They say, all right, hey, I know you've done a lot of bad stuff. If you die fighting for me like this, you'll go to heaven. And so, okay, that appeals to me. So he has these people that ultimately, when they try to oppose the church, and that's what we're going to get into, Lord willing, next Sunday, as when they begin to say, wait a minute, I don't like the way this is going now. They have these people to come in and actually take care of them and execute them. So they're gaining this army as we continue on. So it is certain that the Crusades did much to harm both in the East and in the West, and that the so-called benefits were actually logical developments which would have materialized anyway without the Crusades. So again, nothing was really gained. Some territory was bought back, but they still ultimately didn't get their goal of Jerusalem, which is what the Crusades were all about. So, as we get to that, and thinking again as we're building up to this idea that, and from that I hope you understand that the Crusades are painted as Christians that are going to fight against non-Christians, taking back, and that's essentially all it was they said, we've got to get land back. So this is what the Pope is trying to achieve from this, and because he was the Pope, because he was God in the flesh, because he was doing all these things, it looked upon like this is right, this is what we should be doing. And from that, we find that it didn't really help anything. It gained a little bit of control back, but ultimately it gave more power to the Pope, and that being that of Rome, as we'll see when we continue through our study, that you don't oppose him on anything. And we find that throughout that. And then finally, people just have had enough of him, and we'll get on further into that with the Reformation of the church and these other churches breaking off from that. So any questions or comments? That was a little short. I've been keeping y'all over quite a bit, so I guess I'll give you some time back. But anybody got any questions or comments maybe about the Crusades? Some of those events that were happening. All right.